to In Focus on this Sunday, September 22nd, 2019. I'm Cheryl Wills. Just 8 days from now, Jews around the world begin their most sacred season, the High Holy Days, starting with the celebration of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. But it comes at a difficult time, a time when hate crimes, especially anti-Semitic hate crimes, are on the rise here in the city and across the nation. Anti-Semitic hate crimes increased 105% nationwide last year. And according to the NYPD's Hate Crimes Unit, half of those crimes, 33, happened right here in the city. And those statistics are on track to get even worse. There have been 19 anti-Semitic attacks since the new year. Today, we have assembled a panel of experts, advocates, and an elected official to talk about why this hate is happening now, at this time, and where it could lead if it goes unchecked. Then we'll look back at the Crown Heights riots, when pent-up anger exploded into 3 days of deadly violence. But first, meet Toby Levy. She knows all too well what happens when hate takes control. She was just a child when her family had to hide from the Nazis. Now she speaks out against that hate with her story of hope and survival.
I don't think I understood what death is, but I understood terror, fear.
Toby Eisenstein knew fear far younger than any child should have to. The now 85-year-old Brighton Beach resident was born in 1933, the same year that Hitler came to power.
I remember my mom telling me Sunday not to play in front of the house because Poles and Ukrainians are very Orthodox. They go to church every Sunday. Unfortunately, the preachers preach hatred for the Jew.
Hatred for Jews was the central theme for Hitler's reign of terror. Toby recalls how her family was targeted when Germans took over her town in 1941.
Life was ended then, that particular day when the Germans walked in and gave us orders.
Jews in her town were forced to board trains to Lvov. The Germans said they would be resettled in the ghettos of the big city.
My father comes home, tells my mom the news, and he says, I don't believe them. That was the answer to my survival. I don't believe them.
Instead, Toby says her family went into hiding for years in a small backyard barn owned by a local woman.
So we were 9, and 2 weeks later she comes in and says, there isn't a single Jew left in Chodorov. Everybody was picked up, put on the train and taken out. We don't know where they went.
They lived off livestock and day-old bread bought with fabric her father had hidden when the invaders arrived.
We learned not to talk, not to sneeze, not to laugh, and not to cry. But my father was always positive. He said, somebody has to make it. It's no way is it going to be no survivors. There will be survivors, and they will tell the world. Maybe it's us.
Her father was right. There were only 31 survivors in Chodorov. Toby's family was among them. After the war ended in 1945, they made it to the safe American zone, and later to the United States, where Toby married and became Toby Levy. But the little girl whose family cheated death will never forget.
I'm 85, I have not figured it out yet. I don't understand the hatred. It comes from very early on. Such a hatred. I need all of you, the world, to be witness. We cannot let it go.
And here we are, more than 7 decades later, and the climate of anti-Semitic hate is rearing its ugly head yet again. Let's talk about it with Jewish New Yorkers who are doing something about it. Queens Assemblyman Daniel Rosenthal is here. We're also pleased to have Evan Bernstein, the New York and New Jersey Regional Director for the Anti-Defamation League. Rabbi Lev Meyerowitz-Nelson is the Director of Rabbinic Training for Trua. And Dr. Cheryl Fishbein is the President of the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York. Welcome, one and all. Thank you for your time today. I want to start with you, Assemblyman. You know the numbers all too well. Sobering statistics, 105% increase in anti-Semitic hate crimes nationwide, about half of them happening right here in New York City. Share with us what the state is doing in response to this crisis.
It really is a crisis, and these numbers are extremely concerning. They started off with SWAT stickers being drawn, and now we see in Brooklyn that men are being physically assaulted for dressing as Orthodox Jews, and it's really the copy-paste press releases and tweets are getting old quickly. People are genuinely on edge. And New York State has fortunately been proactive in this. This past year in the New York State budget, they allocated about $25 million to help secure culturally sensitive areas, non-public religious schools, daycares, and other culturally sensitive areas. So New York State has been proactive, but we need to do more. Because these press releases, we appreciate that people are standing with their community, but it's getting old quick, and people are still literally being beaten up on the streets.
Yeah, it's very disturbing to see. As you know, I'm also an anchor, and when I report these stories, it's appalling. It really is. Mr. Bernstein, the public discourse is ugly, not only in person, but also online.
Yes.
And you say what's missing is a moderate middle. What do you mean by that?
Unfortunately, we've seen now, since the advent of the internet, and you see people on Facebook and other platforms where there was more of a moderate middle. We've seen an erosion in this country, and we've even seen it in this city, where people were maybe in the middle and they could listen to both sides and had friends from both sides of the aisle, ideologically, now are just pushing themselves into corners where they're only hearing from people that are like-minded. And that's a dangerous thing, because if you're not hearing all the voices and hearing all the opinions, then it's hard to formulate, well-informed thoughts on people and individuals. And I think we're seeing that more and more. And I think it's a huge challenge with how much hate has gone online, and we're seeing that now on these platforms.
Right. It's certainly no surprise that the increase, if all any one individual listens to is their particular podcast or newscast that feeds them hate all day. What do we do about that?
I think, hate is a learned behavior. We need to get to young people. It's impossible. I have 2 young children to monitor everything they're doing on the internet. I think it's an imperative that it becomes best practice as families and schools to train children early on about how important management of the internet is and what they're looking at and seeing. And in the society right now, we're seeing normalization of hate and normalization of things online that we cannot continue to allow to seep into our schools.
Right. And Dr. Fishbein, I know you feel very strongly about this. How do we stop the normalization, especially online, with vulnerable children?
Well, that's exactly what we've been thinking about, and there's got to be some teaching in the schools, teaching of tolerance, teaching that there's no room for racism, there's no room for anti-Semitism, there's no room for any kind of hate of any kind. As we said, children are not born hating. Children are born loving, cute, sweet. And what we have to do is make sure that they're taught otherwise. I'm not sure we can get through into people's internets, but what we can do is make sure that in the school system and at home, that people are teaching their children the correct way.
Is it time for a new curriculum starting at young ages
Absolutely.
to get to these children?
Absolutely. And as a matter of fact, yesterday, the police commissioner, James O'Neill, he was at our Jewish Community Relations Council board meeting, and he himself brought up the issue of teaching. He said, kids don't know history. They don't know what they're doing when they're saying these things and when they're knocking hats off of innocent people's heads. For them, it might be a fun thing, but they don't understand how it gets to the root of people's histories. And that was exactly his point, and I think it was right on.
Yeah, spot on, yeah. Rabbi, you say there's a split within the Jewish community on how to deal with anti-Semitic hate. Share with us what you mean by a split.
I think there's a large segment of the Jewish community that does a sort of circle the wagons thing, that wants to say we have to take care of our own, we have to step up our own protection. And there's certainly some truth in that, but I think there's also an important need to build bridges to other minority communities, because anti-Semitism is also part of Islamophobia, xenophobia, racism, white nationalism, and I think we need to see all those phenomena together as part of a threat to American democracy.
Yeah, it's a threat to American democracy. Would you agree, especially as an elected official?
Absolutely. I tend to believe that if you hate Jews, you probably also hate blacks. You probably also hate Asians. You also probably hate other minorities. Hate, again, is something, I don't think hate is specific towards one sect, but when you hate one, there's a real chance that you hate others as well. And it's really hard to believe that in a city as diverse as New York, this is still people are still picking up these behaviors, this hate, in a city so diverse where we live so close to each other, so many different cultures. You can drive 2 minutes or walk 5 minutes in any direction, and you're in a different culture in a different community. And we really need to work together to figure out why these stereotypes are still happening and why this hate is still happening.
And why? Yeah, please. Just a quick thing to what the rabbi said, that at JCRC, what we do is exactly deal with both. In one of our major programs is outreach, interfaith, intergroup, meetings between Jews, Muslims. How do we work together with Asians, with Chinese, with you name it, Latino populations, Black populations. We just co-chaired a criminal justice that you know, all day on criminal. That was wonderful to end.
We're going to talk about that at the end of the show.
Yeah, but on the other side, what we're doing is, together with UJ Federation of New York, is bulking up the security systems. We have probably more than 3,000 for the Jewish community sites across the New York metropolitan area, and the security systems have to be bulked up.
Absolutely.
And we're working on it.
Okay, especially ahead of the new year. We're going to take a quick break. In Focus will continue with a look at how the city can educate the masses about tolerance. We touched on it. We're going to do a deeper dive on that when we come back. Thanks for staying with us as we talk about issues facing the city's Jewish community. Rabbi, you were making a point after Dr. Fishbein talked about it, the anti-Semitism is coming from multiple directions. Your point is?
So there's anti-Semitism across the spectrum because we live in a culture that's anti-Semitic, but they're different from each other because the anti-Semitism on the right and the white nationalism that's helping to spawn it is a lot more violent. It's got a lot more guns. You don't often see left-wing activists shooting up a synagogue or a Jewish community center. So I think we have to keep that distinction in mind.
And Mr. Bernstein, you wanted to talk about...
I would just argue that language is dangerous in general, and that language that's being used on both sides is dangerous and spreads more hate. So I don't like that's a partisan thing. I believe that anti-Semitism is a problem on fringes on both sides of the political spectrum. So we just, and language, you have to be responsible with words that you use.
Sure. For sure, but there's language and there's bullets.
Starts with language.
Yeah.
Okay. And Mr. Bernstein, you wanted to talk about your organization's partnership with parents.
Yeah, I think we talked a lot in this conversation about how to get to young people. We know that this is an issue that we need to get to young people now as the normalization of hate is taking place. One of the things that the ADL has been able to do very successfully is partner with the Department of Education here in New York City and across the country. And we're one of the leading providers of anti-bias education here in New York City. And we take a lot of pride in that. One of the things that we do when a school becomes a no place for hate school, it is working with the administration, working with the students, but also working with the parents. And I think that's a key component. This can't just be any one of those given silos. It needs to be a team effort within the entire school, and that includes the parents. And
How many of those schools exist?
Right now in New York, we're in over 200 schools and growing. We need to be in more schools, and unfortunately, we're more proactive. A lot of times it's a hate incident, and then the superintendent or school district will call us in to kind of help out.
Like an intervention.
An intervention, and we prefer to be proactive. Sure. We believe being proactive when it comes to hate and bias is critical, and the work that we do is not just around anti-Semitism, it's overall anti-bias, because bias, again, is not just towards Jews, it's towards other minority groups as well.
Sure, and Dr. Fishbein, that's your point.
Bullying as well?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
And that's part of your platform.
That's part of it.
Yeah.
You know, the bullying, once it's permitted, it starts to roll along, and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
It snowballs.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Rabbi, we can't end this conversation without talking about the protection of Israel. What do you make of the current climate?
Current climate in Israel?
Yeah.
You know that the majority of Jews want to see a two-state solution and an end to the occupation. I think it's both a moral and a practical imperative for the protection of Israel. I think the biggest existential threat is that occupation continuing and kind of eroding Israel's democracy and Israel's soul.
And Dr. Fishbein, I do want to touch upon women empowerment within the Jewish community, especially among ultra-Orthodox Jews.
Yes.
Where do we stand with that?
I think we have to respect the communities as they set their own cultural norms. I think if you're in these communities and you get to know them, women feel proud of their role in society. I think if you look at it specifically only a problem of women. That's not correct, because both men and women have their prescribed roles within the community, and to try to break out of that is difficult for both. And I'd like to be fair for everybody. It would be, I'm not part of that, living my life every single day, but as I respect, you have to respect the communities. If someone wants to come out, we have programs to help them. But again, it's men, it's women. And so I won't, that's how I feel about that.
I consider myself a member of the Orthodox community.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of different shades of Orthodox, but my wife is very successful in her own career. Much more successful than I am.
So it varies.
So it does vary, and if someone wants to have a career and have professional dreams, they can do that.
Okay, and so I think a key takeaway as we close is that there's no one size fits all in the Jewish community. There are many different layers, many different opinions, many different shades, just like everyone else.
Different axes.
Absolutely, but tolerance is key. Is key.
That's right.
Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time. I truly appreciate it. When we come back, last weekend there was a Jewish call to action at a conference attended by hundreds. I was there, and we'll have some highlights in our final focus. In our final focus, a coalition of Jewish organizations joined forces last weekend to address one of the city's most pressing issues, criminal justice reform. Three prominent groups, the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York, and the UJA Federation of New York, all sponsored the day-long event. They invited activists to raise awareness on the impact of mass incarceration and the school-to-prison pipeline, among other issues. The goal was to educate and mobilize Jewish communities to work with Black and Latino leaders to fix the broken criminal justice system, where far too many New Yorkers fall through the cracks. It was a necessary and important dialogue, and it was a pleasure to be a part of it. Thanks so much for watching In Focus. We appreciate you spending your Sunday with us. We're back with our guests talking about the issues facing New York City's Jewish community. Assemblyman, you were making a point about the security.
Right. Growing up, it was very common. The high holidays are coming up in the Jewish community. It was very normal to go to a synagogue for prayers and not see security.
Right.
Now to go to a synagogue and not have security there, it's almost unheard of. It's mind-blowing. Yeah. And you don't realize how these things change, but when you look back, you see how it happened, because it's human nature to get used to things. But there's something that we have to realize, that it is changing and that we cannot get used to this.
Right. Rabbi, are you satisfied with the level of security?
It's important, but it's also an imperfect solution. It's something like 20% of the Jewish community is people of color, and they walk into a synagogue with a police officer who may not expect them to be there because of their stereotypes about who's a Jew, and that makes them really unwelcome and uncomfortable. So it's a problem. It's an imperfect solution. Imperfect solution.
Mr. Bernstein, you wanted to discuss language, specifically an ugly incident in Jersey where a person made a negative comment. Share with us.
Yeah, unfortunately, this past week we've had the deal in Trenton, New Jersey. The Trenton City Council and the President of the City Council made a comment on tape about Jewing somebody down. And then actually had a couple of other City Council members double down on stating that's not an issue, that it's a verb. It is not a verb. It is an anti-Semitic trope, and it's something that cannot be tolerated in our society. And fortunately, a lot of people, including the governor of New Jersey, Governor Murphy, spoke out very loudly against what took place, but it took too long, and the answers that came out right away within the City Council was very disturbing. And I think the fact that, that can happen in today's day and age, and that people feel comfortable enough to say "Jew me down" in that way as a verb from an elected official who is a community leader, I think is showing where filters now are being removed, even at some of the highest levels. And it's an incredibly difficult situation. And we have to push back on it. Because again, children are seeing this, young people see this behavior from elected officials, and they have to be better than that.
Right. And Dr. Fishbein, how do we teach tolerance? And we touched on this in the first segment. How do we teach tolerance on a broad scale so it gets into the homes? That's a tough one, right?
It is a tough one. It's got to start from, I guess, the root, which would be curriculum in the schools and on TV.
Right.
Shows like this.
Shows like this, and that's why we're doing this show.
Yeah, public segments on all over the place. Do you know, love your neighbor kind of segments might be an answer.
Who's setting this ugly climate? Who's setting this ugly climate where we see this spike, Rabbi?
I mean, it's coming from the top.
What's the top?
We see it in the president's rhetoric. We see it in the people he surrounds himself with. We see it in the people he approves on Twitter. The kind of fine folks on both sides kind of discussion.
Right, and Charlottesville was a shock. But, Mr. Bernstein, you say we may not see one like that again. Why?
Our Center on Extremism, which is basically a think tank and thought leader on extremism in the United States at the Anti-Defamation League, you know, what happened after Charlottesville, over full analysis, that there were supposed to be other events after Charlottesville with Richard Spencer and David Duke and others. They all went underground. They all went online. And the facial recognition software played a real role in people getting outed for the behavior and what they were saying in Charlottesville. And it became a real fear of being in public, being someone that was spouting off white supremacist ideologies and rhetoric. And I think it makes it scarier. I think that was a moment where you got to see the ugly face of hate, but that hate now is online. And one of the biggest things we've done after creating a Center on Extremism, we've now opened an office in Silicon Valley, Center for Technology and Society, that works with online platforms, because you know that's where hate is going. And that's, especially after Charlottesville, that's where so much of the hate, and those people are now going on blogs and everything else, like you saw in Poway and the shooter in Pittsburgh.
Is YouTube, Google, Twitter, are they doing enough by canceling a lot of, you know, people who are too slow?
It's out there, people see it, it breeds more hate.
They're trying.
They say
they're trying.
Are they not moving fast enough?
I think the way that the algorithm pushes people towards more radical sources is really dangerous for our whole society, not just Jews.
What I want to say about that is that we have to be also very, very careful about freedom of speech.
Well, that's the fine line.
And that's the fine line. And we can't, that's why we can't legislate against this. Again, in Europe, they can and they do, but here, they can't and they won't. And you can argue on both sides of that, of course. But I also think in JCRC and just me as an individual, want to walk a centrist line. And you don't want to go too far right, too far left. And this anti-Semitism is coming from both directions. It's easy to point at Charlottesville and Charlottesville only, but the atmosphere out there is coming from everywhere. It's a permissible thing to do right now, is to be anti-Semitic, racist, anti-immigrant, but from both sides of the political spectrum.
In Focus continues right after this. And now, a flashback from our New York One archives. August 19th, 2001, some 18 years ago. The people of Crown Heights come together to mark 10 years since the community was overwhelmed with violence and hate, and to celebrate the lessons learned.
We as a community have learned to sit down and communicate. We've been able to sit down and work out differences. We're able to have our children play together.
It all started with a tragic accident. 7-year-old Gavin Cato was fixing his bicycle when a car carrying an Hasidic leader drove through a red light or yellow. No one is certain to this day. But here's what we do know. That car hit little Gavin, and he was killed instantly.
Simply was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back.
Tensions were already simmering between the Hasidic and black communities in Crown Heights, and then it exploded. Riots broke out. 29-year-old rabbinical student Yankel Rosenbaum was attacked by an angry mob, beaten and stabbed to death. Countless homes and cars were vandalized. Stores were looted. More than 150 police officers and nearly 40 civilians were hurt, and more than 100 people arrested.
Lawlessness and violence will not be tolerated under any circumstances.
But the rioting continued for 3 long nights. And it took 10 years of hard work before the broken community found common ground again.
Ignorance, I guess, is a wonderful excuse, but it's even a better reason to break it down because you find so much togetherness.